Bun găsit! Astăzi reluăm un interviu cu unul dintre cei mai cunoscuți scriitori ucraineni, Andrei Kurkov, despre tragedia țării sale. La falsuri de colecție vom afla dacă jurnalul lui Hitler a existat cu adevărat. Iar spărgătorii de fake news ne vorbesc despre politicienii care cred că norii de pe cerul României sunt semnul unui război care ne este ascuns. Începem cu interviul ediției. Andrei Kurkov este unul dintre cei mai importanți scriitori ucraineni contemporani. Scrie în rusă, dar Moscova l-a catalogat drept dușman al culturii ruse. Crede că finalul fericit al războiului va fi foarte amar, dar cultura ucraineană va fi mai puternică. Andrei Kurkov, thank you for accepting this interview. You were born in Leningrad, grew up in Kiev, and you live now both in Kiev and London. You are Ukrainian's best-selling author. You changed your location twice since Russia invaded Ukraine after receiving information that you are on a wanted list because of your outspoken criticism of President Vladimir Putin. Will you go back from Bucharest to Kiev with your family, your wife and 3 children?
Well, first of all, I don't know exactly whether I'm on the wanted list or not, but I'm sure the whole of Ukrainian culture is in danger and on the wanted list, because 2 years ago there was an attempt to kidnap Ukrainian cult poet Sergei Zhadan in Minsk. We are now in Transcarpathian region near Uzhhorod with my wife and my elder son, and I would like to go to Kiev because many people are coming back to Kiev. But from Kiev, you cannot travel abroad now, and I am traveling to take part in the conferences and in the events dedicated to Ukraine. So probably we'll stay in Western Ukraine for now.
But this information is real about the wanted list, and we know some other major writers, Russian also, that are afraid for their life, and Kasparov also. So is this real?
I don't know. I haven't seen the list, so I cannot say. I know that I'm announced an enemy of Russian culture. There were articles against me and my books in Russian press, and my books are not on sale anymore and not published in Russia. First time they were banned in 2005. Then from 2008, no more new editions. And from 2014, it is illegal to bring my books for sale from Ukraine to Russia. So I am not on the welcome list. But in journalism, you have to produce facts. So I don't have this list in my hands, I cannot say. I know that I am not a very welcome person and probably in danger. But that's all I can say.
But till 2005, they considered you a Russian writer or a Ukrainian writer?
Well, in Russia, they were considering me a Russian writer, and even Tatiana Tolstoy in one of the interviews said that, no, he is a Russian writer, and everybody who writes in Russian is a Russian writer. But afterwards, actually, there was some kind of change, and some Russian intellectuals agreed that Russian language literature is not necessarily Russian literature. And I belong to Russian language literature of Ukraine. There are Russian language writers in Switzerland, Mikhail Shishkin, or in New York, or in Israel. So, I mean, it's, Russian language became lingua franca like French and English. And the history of Russian language reminds me the history of francophonie, of French language culture.
And what happened in 2005?
Well, the Orange Revolution happened. Okay. And first time, actually, Ukraine showed that Ukraine doesn't want to live according to the Russian metrics of political and social life. And I mean, I should say that Russians and Ukrainians are very different, not the same people as Putin says, that's for sure, because they have 2 different mentalities. Russians are collective. They are used to the monarchy. I mean, in fact, the Soviet Union was a communist monarchy because every general secretary of the Communist Party worked as a general secretary until his death, except for Ukrainian Nikita Khrushchev, who was dismissed after Karib crisis. And now, actually, Russia is back to the monarchy. They love their Tsar, Vladimir Putin, and they will stay with him and defend him, and he will talk on behalf of Russian nation. Ukrainians are individualists, and they are anarchists also, natural anarchists, because in 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, Ukraine was independent territory with no monarchy, no royal family, no aristocracy, but they had elections of hetmans. Hetman was the head of the state, head of the army, and he was elected. He was not sort of appointed or put in place by some other forces. And so, I mean, Ukrainians are used to elect whom they will hate later. So I mean, this is a traditional, I mean, the best example of Ukrainian individualism is the fact that Ukraine has more than 400 political parties registered in the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine. So we never have the same party ruling the country. Every party which comes with the president disappears after the president is gone. And people don't remember these political parties, but they were forces, important forces in politics for 3, 4 years, for 2 years. I mean, like Yanukovych's party, Party of Region, which is from Donbass. Nobody thinks about this party anymore. Yanukovych is in Moscow, the party is gone.
But this is democracy. I mean, Putin is afraid of that kind of democracy. He's afraid that Russians will look at Ukraine and said, okay, this is possible also in Russia.
This is true, but in fact, this type of democracy existed also in Russia in the beginning of 20th century. There were many political forces and parties present in the parliament in 1912, 13, 14. But I mean, it's gone because I mean, now it is authoritarian one-party system like Soviet Union. So if you are a functionary, if you are state servant, you have to belong to United Russia Party of President Putin. And this is the Soviet system just reworked and turned into some kind of state capitalism.
What is Ruski Mir?
Ruski Mir, I mean, it was started as a humanitarian project to unite all Russian speakers in the world around Moscow, sort of to make them friendly and loyal to Russia independently from their passports. But very quickly, and maybe from the very beginning, the idea behind it was actually geopolitical, to be able to use all Russian speakers in the world as the political forces which will defend and support any policy Moscow wants to have. And we see it now in Germany, where the demonstrations to support the war in Ukraine are organized in Berlin, in Köln, in German cities by descendants of Russian emigres and by ex-Soviet people.
And these guys, you think, are free? I mean, they do that by their own will, or it's orchestrated?
Some of them probably do. Some of them do love Putin and think actually, I mean, it's very strange to think that actually if you left Russia or Soviet Union and you have a comfortable, free life in the West, and I mean, it's strange, I mean, you will have attachment, emotional attachment to your motherland, to your roots, but not to political system that Putin installed. But they do, I mean, many people of Russian origin in the West, they support Putin. They think it is nice that the world is afraid of Russia, afraid of Putin. That means that they are becoming more important. I mean, if somebody is afraid of you, you are not more important, you are more dangerous.
You said that the Ukrainian, their destiny is individual, and the Russians' destiny is collective. Yeah. But the most significant minority in Ukraine is the Russian one. Yeah. And maybe Putin hope that the Russians in Ukraine will welcome the Russian army with flowers, like liberators. Why he was wrong? Well,
first of all, of course, he was misinformed by his FSB generals, and apparently one of the generals now is under arrest. He got a lot of false information about the political mood in Russian-speaking community in Ukraine. Most of Russian speakers in Ukraine, they are Ukrainians, they are not Russians politically, not ethnically. And actually, they are used to freedom. they can see that in Russia you can be put into prison or you can be fined for reposting something on Facebook. The Ukrainians of any origin are so used to freedom, they cannot imagine that actually coming back to this Soviet kind of control. So I mean, also Russian speakers, if you speak Russian, it doesn't mean that you love Putin and you support his ideas. You can be more interested in Russian culture, or you could be before this war, because now it is actually over with Russian culture. But in fact, actually, Russian speakers who also became the first victims of this war, because Mariupol is a Russian-speaking city with Russian and Greek ethnic minority. And 10 or 20,000 people are killed there. Kharkiv is bombed by Russia every day. It is a Russian-speaking city. 95% of people in Kharkiv speak Russian language. Chernihiv, probably 70% of Russian speakers. It is not a war to defend Russian speakers or to defend ethnic Russians. It's the war to incorporate Ukraine into new Russian Empire or new Soviet Union. That's why actually the Russian speakers, most of them, I mean, they are afraid of this prospect in the future. They want to remain free. I'm sure there is some percentage of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians who support Putin in Ukraine, who would like to bring flowers to the army. But I mean, they are a tiny minority and nobody will sell them flowers for this purpose.
You said that the biggest victim of this war will be Russian language and Russian culture. How come?
Well, because we live in the world when the culture can be cancelled. And it happened before the war in Europe. And now it's turn for Russian culture to be cancelled in Ukraine, because Russian language is officially the language of the enemy. And it's interesting that this is repeated by people who speak Russian in Ukraine. So they are sacrificing their mother tongue in their thoughts for the future of their country. Many people are changing language. I mean, they start speaking Ukrainian. Lots of Russian speakers started writing posts on Facebook in Ukrainian instead of Russian, including me. I do use sometimes Russian because I don't want to say that I just reject my mother tongue. I mean, my mother tongue doesn't depend on Putin, and Putin has no monopoly on the Russian language. But I understand the emotions of Ukrainians who lost their parents, children, relatives and friends because of the Russian invasion. And so everything which is coming from Russia is something to deal with enemy. It should be stopped and it should be safeguarded and it should be actually resisted.
You will write from now on in Russian? Or you wrote some books in Ukrainian also?
But fiction, novels, I will continue to write in Russian because it is my mother tongue. I can write much better in my mother tongue than in Ukrainian, which I learned many years ago. I mean, I speak without accent, but my knowledge of Ukrainian is not sufficient to be such a good writer in Ukrainian as, for example, Taras Prochasko or Yurko Vinichuk, who were brought up and who grew up with Ukrainian language. So I don't want to assimilate. I want to be integrated. And I think actually many minorities in Ukraine are not properly integrated, not because they did not want to integrate, because they were ignored by politicians for a long time.
I mean, Russian language and the culture and the literature will survive Putin, no?
Dostoevsky will survive Putin, but Dostoevsky will also suffer, like Pushkin will suffer, because Pushkin is used now by Russian ideologists in the demonstrations, for example, organized by the librarians in Russia in support of Russian army. They are using Pushkin, they are using Russian culture, they are using everything from ballet to theater to show that they are higher race. And I think also Europe should be very aware of this, because Russia was investing in the cultural image of their country millions and millions of dollars and euros over 20 years, trying to compensate with this positive cultural image their negative political image. And now people think that they know everything about Russian culture, but they know nothing about Russian politics. Only now they can see the results of this politics on TV, in the news.
We talk about the great Russian culture these days and about the West who wants to cancel this culture. And we are talking about Tchaikovsky, who is not played anymore in by some orchestra, and about Gergiev, and about Anna Netrebko, and so on and so on. It's a proper topic, this one. I mean, there is a war and children dying there. Do we have to talk about the great Russian culture these days?
I think it's better to take a break and not to talk about great Russian culture in the times when actually great Russian culture is used to destroy Ukraine and Ukrainian culture. I wouldn't mix Netrebko, Gergiev and Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky is dead. He was excellent composer. He was also partially Ukrainian and he lived in Ukraine. But Netrebko and Gergiev, they supported openly Putin's policies, and they are responsible for this war as well and as much as Putin and other politicians of Russia.
Some of your friends, writer friends, like Sorokin and Shishkin and so on, and Ulitskaya are living already in exile in West. They are opposing the war, they are opposing to Putin. But some other great writers are still living in Russia and they are supporting Putin and the messianic role of Russian civilization. Do you think that the West will read these writers in other way after the war?
You know, it's interesting that the writers who support Putin are not translated into foreign languages. They are not international writers. They are not telling the story of Russia to the outside world, unlike Shishkin, unlike Sorokin, unlike Ulitskaya. So we are dealing actually with the internal writers who support imperialistic ideology inside the country. So they are more like propagandists than writers. And yes, they sign open letters to support Russian aggression in Ukraine, but it doesn't make them great. It doesn't make them better as writers. So, I mean, I don't think we have to care about their books or what they are writing about, because their actions show us what they are.
You experienced the war. You lived in Kiev. How do you live through the war?
Well, I only stayed 2 or 3 days after the beginning of the war, but I can tell you that it is like completely different life begins when you are woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning by explosions outside your window. This is a terrible feeling. I mean, you feel helpless. You understand that now nothing material has any role. I mean, we left our apartment and a house in the countryside, and when I was driving for 22 hours to Lviv, mostly standing in the traffic jams, because, I mean, there were tens of thousands of cars escaping from everywhere in Ukraine, not only from Kiev. But, I mean, when you are in this state, you understand that the life which is behind you, the life which ended on the 24th of February, will never come back. It will never return. Your life is changed. I mean, you were born, I mean, I was told by my grandfather many years ago that how lucky you are you were born after the war. He meant after the Second World War. He didn't know that actually I was born before the war, not after the war. And I'm thinking now about my children who are 19, 24 and 25. I mean, they were born before the war, definitely. And they had this experience because they were all in Ukraine when it happened. And we had to look for our children because they were in Lviv on the day of the war, and Lviv was also bombarded. And my daughter lives in London. We don't live, with my wife, we don't live in London anymore. I mean, we used to go there and spend months and months until 1997, but since then we're just there for holiday. But my daughter, when she got stuck in Lviv, and then I had to find her and to take her to Uzhhorod, and my friends helped to send her to Slovakia. And then I was looking for a plane that could take her back to London because she lives and works there. I mean, I don't want you to have this experience.
You think that Ukrainians will be different after the war? The identity will be forged? They will look in some other way to the life?
It's a good question because I mentioned that Ukrainians are individualists. But this is the third time they got together to defend the future of their country. The first time was Orange Revolution. Second time was Euromaidan 2013-14, which ended up with annexation of Crimea and non-stop war in Donbass, and now the third time. So practically Putin was working hard to consolidate Ukrainian nation. And he achieved what he didn't want. Because, I mean, Ukrainian nation is ready to defend itself and to defend the Ukrainian statehood and independence. It doesn't mean that every Ukrainian is prepared to take arms. Of course, I mean, the society is different, but the number of people who are patriots and who don't see themselves as refugees abroad is much bigger now than it could be 20 years ago.
When you see the atrocities in Borodianka, in Bucha, Irpin, and you hear Putin and the other guys, Peskov and so on, they are saying that everything is fake. What do you think?
No, I don't believe any word that Putin or Lavrov is saying already for 15 years. I mean, the lie is part of their politics. I mean, I think Putin said in 2014 or 15 that if we have to lie for the sake of our country, we will lie non-stop. So, I mean, this is the political culture and this is social culture because it means that actually all Russians are prepared to lie to defend what they think is right for Russia. And they think it is right to fight against Ukraine and to kill Ukrainian civilians. So, I mean, why should I take seriously whatever they say? The world already understands what they mean when they lie. And maybe not the whole world, because Europe definitely understands. Latin America doesn't, because it's too far away. And now, actually, the Russian propagandists are very active in Latin America, sharing fake news about Ukraine being a country of anti-Semitism and that it is dangerous to be a Jew in Ukraine. About corruption we can talk and talk and talk, and there is corruption, yes, but much less than it was before 2005.
And much less than in Russia.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Because Putin said that we have to save Ukrainians from corruption before invading. Yeah.
But in fact, I think the Russian losses in the war are also due to the Russian corruption in the military forces. So God bless their corruption. It helps us to survive also.
But what about the people in Russia? Do they believe in propaganda? Do they really believe that these atrocities were not committed by Russian army?
I think some people believe, maybe a lot of people who believe, but I'm sure there are people who are just afraid to say that they don't believe. So they will be silent. They are accomplices, because, I mean, if you are silent, if you know that this is not true, but you support it, you are also an accomplice. You are co-author of this tragedy. And I think, I mean, Russian nation will have to repent like Germans had to repent for years and years after the Second World War.
All your books are with a very good humor. I don't know if it's your natural humor or it's belong to the Ukrainian society, the Russian, I don't know, culture and so on. But you invented a moral category, black optimism. What is that?
Well, in 1992, when we had a huge social crisis in Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of my friends emigrated to Germany and to Israel, and they were sure that I am going also to emigrate. And one of them, and I was always an optimist, and one of my friends, Sasha Belfer, before going to America, he asked me, are you still a stupid optimist, or you are now a normal pessimist like everybody else? And I said, no, I am a black optimist. And he asked, what does it mean, black optimist? And I said, it's somebody who knows that everything will be good in the end, but he is not sure he will survive to this moment. So I'm now a gray optimist, like gray bees. I believe that I can survive and I can see a happy end in this story, and I understand that happy end will be very bitter, of course, because of all the losses inflicted on Ukrainian state and society. But Ukraine will survive. Ukraine survived artificial famines in 1932-33, in 1947. Ukraine survived mass deportations of Ukrainian farmers who didn't want to be collectivized. Ukraine will survive this war. I mean, maybe Ukraine will become smaller because Russia is huge and has a huge army, and they can bite off more of Ukrainian territory. But Ukraine will resist to the very end, and I'm sure Ukraine will stand against the enemy.
What do you think about the West and the West hypocrisy? For a long time, even after 2014, and Ukraine was in war since then, the West preferred to do business with Putin and forget about war. Now, do you think that the West can do more?
I think I don't know everything the West is doing. I know that America is helping, Great Britain is helping a lot. Germany is finally ready to help. But actually it was Germany who was dealing with Putin more than other countries after annexation of Crimea and after the beginning of the war in Donbass. It was Angela Merkel who wanted to appease Putin and to build Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. And of course, I mean, for me, the actions like this showed that Ukraine meant nothing for Germany because they wanted investment, to put investment in big country like Russia. Ukraine was smaller country and less important, less predictable. And the same probably can be said about other European countries. I mean, now they can see the result of this policy. Because in fact, actually, France and Germany were selling arms to Russia until the war began. From 2014, they were selling high technology arms and weapons to Russian army.
I'm quoting the title of one of your article in New Yorker. What will be the legacy of this Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, there will be several layers of legacy. I mean, cultural legacy, Ukrainian culture will be much more strong to resist other cultures, including Russian culture. Socially, it will be very traumatic for people who have relatives in Russia, and these relatives mostly support Putin. So there will be a lot of ties, family ties cut. Because what happened after 2014, for 2 years, relatives didn't talk to each other even on the phone. And then many families agreed to talk, but not to discuss politics. Now you cannot not discuss politics with your Russian relatives. On the political level, I think pro-Russian political parties will not be able to exist in Ukrainian politics because they all turned out to be traitors and collaborators. And in the occupied territory now, in some places, new mayors are installed by Russian occupation forces who were members of the so-called Opposition for Life party, which is what remains from Party of Region, the pro-Russian political force. There will be other legacies, of course. Rebuilding of cultural heritage will require a lot of time and money because we have theaters demolished and destroyed by bombings. We have museums burned down. We have hundreds of schools destroyed, universities damaged and destroyed. So, I mean, the education is also impacted and it will have to be restructured. And I think everything Russian will go away from all educational processes. Now there are demands of the parents, for example, in Zhytomyr city, to exclude Russian language from curriculum, from school curriculum, to replace it with another additional foreign language. So I mean, the legacy will be very, very multifaceted and complicated, but Ukraine will have to deal with it.
Andrei Kurkov, thank you so much for this
Thank you very much.
Este timpul pentru un nou fals istoric. Scandalul jurnalelor secrete ale lui Hitler este unul dintre cele mai mari din istoria jurnalismului german. Gabriela Avram explică.
Memoriile și jurnalele au trezit întotdeauna interesul publicului și al criticii, mai ales când e vorba de manuscrise descoperite la multă vreme după moartea autorului. Este exact ceea ce s-a întâmplat cu așa numitul jurnal secret al lui Hitler. Povestea spune că în ultimele zile ale celui de-al doilea război mondial, un avion de mici dimensiuni, la bordul căruia se afla printre alții și omul de încredere al lui Hitler, care avea asupra lui și lucruri personale ale dictatorului, se prăbușește la granița cu Cehoslovacia. Tot povestea spune că la aflarea veștii, Hitler ar fi afirmat că acest lucru este o catastrofă și că s-au pierdut astfel însemnările pe care dorea să le lase moștenire posterității. La începutul anilor 80, pictorul și ilustratorul german Konrad Kujau anunța că se află în posesia jurnalului lui Hitler. Printre cunoscuții acestuia se numără și Gerd Heidemann, ziarist la publicația germană Stern. Acesta din urmă îl convinge pe Peter Koch, redactorul șef al revistei, să plătească 10 milioane de mărci germane pentru cumpărarea drepturilor de autor. Era vorba de 62 de caiete legate în imitație de piele neagră și care cuprindeau însemnări din perioada 1932-1935. Sunt consultați istoricii Hugh Trevor Roper și Gerhard Weiberg, care confirmă autenticitatea însemnărilor. Așa că pe 25 aprilie 1983, ziarul săptămânal Stern titra pe prima pagină: "S-au descoperit jurnalele lui Hitler" și publica 10 pasaje despre care se presupune că au fost scrise de dictator. Doar că lui Hitler nu-i prea plăcea să scrie, iar când era nevoit folosea creionul. Însemnările publicate sunt însă trimise la analiză pentru verificarea autenticității și se dovedește că acestea conțineau materiale care nici nu existau pe vremea când se presupune că au fost scrise. Sunt analizate și celelalte documente, iar în luna mai, Hans Bums, șeful arhivelor Germaniei Federale, declară că însemnările publicate de Stern reprezintă un fals flagrant, grotesc și neserios. Urmează un proces. Gerd Heidemann este condamnat la 4 ani și 8 luni de închisoare de către Tribunalul Districtual din Hamburg pentru deturnare de fonduri, iar Konrad Kujau la 4 ani și 6 luni pentru fraudă. Peter Koch, redactorul șef al revistei Stern, demisionează, iar scandalul jurnalelor secrete ale lui Hitler rămâne unul dintre cele mai mari din toată istoria jurnalismului german.
Îngrijorat de liniile albe de pe cer, un politician a cerut explicații autorității aeronautice române. Cine efectuează aceste pulverizări și în ce scop? Spărgătorii de fake news.
Fraților, vremea ne-a ajuns din urmă. Ziua s-a scurtat în favoarea unei nopți lungi, frigul a început să ne ciupească nasurile, războiul ne suflă în continuare în ceafă și apropiatul an 2023 ne promite mai multă inflație și mai multă palpitație la buzunar. Miza e mai mare ca oricând. În condițiile astea, în colțișorul nostru de lume, unii români reușesc să-și pună întrebările corecte, cele care ne îndreaptă privirea către adevăratele probleme și posibilele rezolvări.
Întrebări pe care mica, dar inimoasa noastră echipă de documentariști le-a adunat, le-a fiert o eternitate, le-a presărat cu zahăr pudră și bombonele colorate și le-a legat cu o fundiță roșie pentru a vă prezenta ceea ce în lumea știrilor se cheamă coliva de pe urmă a evenimentelor care chiar contează. Haideți, deci, să o savurăm împreună spre veșnica ei pomenire.
Începem cu o problemă care consumă constant creierele tuturor dacilor liberi. Cerul. Unde e cerul? E sus. Ce e pe cer? Pe cer sunt nori, de diferite forme. Nori transformați de forțele de sculptor ale naturii. Nori așa de delicați că ne demonstrează existența unei divinități. Nori scăldați în lumina dimineții și, bineînțeles, nori care reușesc să pună pe gânduri toți meteorologii. Am putea să vă arătăm asemenea nori toată ziua, dar alta e dilema care ne macină. Nu norii, ci liniile. Ce sunt aceste linii? Deputatul Mihai Lasca a trimis către Autoritatea Aeronautică Civilă o interpelare în care solicită să îi se explice ce sunt liniile albe de pe cer, lăsate în urmă de avioane. Care este scopul pulverizării acestora pe cerul României, precum și cine efectuează aceste pulverizări? Exact! Cât timp o să ne mai păcălească experții spunând că sunt de fapt dâre inocente de condens, lăsate de motorul avioanelor? Deputatul Mihai Lasca e printre singurii oameni care au curajul să abandoneze explicațiile științifice și realitatea și să pună degetul pe rană și o face în mod oficial din calitatea sa de deputat.
În urma cererii depuse, Mihai Lasca a primit și un răspuns. Că sunt dâre de condens și că nu e panică, man. Trece avionul fierbinte prin aerul rece și lasă în urmă niște liniuțe albe. Răspunsul oficial ar putea satisface un om mai naiv, dar nu și pe vigilentul deputat Mihai Lasca. Acum, întrebarea devine: cine a plătit autoritățile să-l mintă pe el că e vorba doar de condens? Ce interese sinistre se află în spatele acestor explicații? Ce sunt, de fapt, dârele de pe cer? Și cu ce ne șpreiază ăștia din înaltul văzduhului? Cine a plătit toți piloții, fizicienii, aviatorii, cercetătorii și profesorii? Și ce vor ăștia să ascundă?
Am putea zăbovi cu zilele în căutarea răspunsului, dar tot Mihai Lască ne atrage atenția că există și alte probleme. Deputatul Mihai Lască, cel care a cerut într-o interpelare trimisă autorității aeronautice civile să îi se explice ce sunt liniile albe de pe cer, pe care le lasă avioanele în urma lor, nu e la prima intervenție de acest fel. Din contră, aceasta este doar una recentă, dintr-o serie de interpelări pe mai multe subiecte, printre care pandemia de coronavirus, în care a cerut să îi se demonstreze existența virusului SARS-CoV-2, sau tragedia aviatică de la începutul anului din Dobrogea, pentru că a citit pe un site că elicopterul Puma și avionul MiG ale armatei române ar fi fost doborâte de ucraineni. Întrebarea și mai pertinentă e alta. Cam câte zile mai durează până își dă omul seama că adevăratul vinovat e, bineînțeles, George Soros? Eu, unul, prezic că nu apucăm sărbătorile și deputatul Mihai Lască ne va arăta că în spatele tuturor avioanelor și liniuțelor de pe cer se află noua ordine mondială, în colaborare cu Soros și cu sprijinul tagmei iudeilor reptilieni, care conduc de fapt planeta prin liniuțe de condens și pandemii inventate. Dar stai, mai e!
De asemenea, alături de o colegă deputat, Mihai Lască a trimis o adresă către CSAT, somând Consiliul Suprem de Apărare a țării să declare public că România nu vrea război. Într-un scurt interviu pentru Digi24.ro, Mihai Lască s-a declarat convins că se dorește implicarea României în conflictul din Ucraina și pune demisia fostului ministru al apărării, Vasile Dâncu, tocmai pe seama faptului că s-a opus intrării României în război. În plus, el spune că Rusia nu ne-a făcut niciun rău în ultimii ani, spre deosebire de Occident, care ne impune tot felul de măsuri foarte, foarte rele. Deci e clar, Rusia e bună și Occidentul e foarte, foarte rău. Asemenea adevăruri chiar nu pot fi rostite de oricine. Cine este însă de fapt acest deputat Mihai Lască? În mod suspect, dar firesc într-un fel, CV-ul său nu apare pe site-ul Camerei Deputaților. Știm că a fost în marele partid de renume mondial AUR, dar și că a fost dat afară de acolo când au aflat ăștia că este urmărit penal pentru organizarea de grup infracțional și este condamnat penal pentru vătămare corporală. Adică omul nostru de bază, în lupta asta grea cu liniuțele albe de pe cer, e din categoria ălora care au fost dați afară din AUR pe motiv că erau prea exagerați în vârâ, în viața reală, cum s-ar spune. După o cercetare jurnalistică extrem de serioasă pe profilul de Facebook al sus numitului deputat, am aflat și misterul. Cu ce se ocupa omul nostru înainte să pună aceste întrebări cheie pentru viitorul democrației? Iată, omul nostru temerar era exact ce vă imaginați. Bodyguard la o firmă unde, bineînțeles, își păzea clienții de liniuțele albe de pe cer și de păcatele Occidentului de la sol. Bravo om! Vrednic este!
Destoinic om! Acum că AUR l-a respins, îl puteți găsi în excelentul partid pe nume Partidul Patrioților Poporului Român. Dați buzna că au mare nevoie de membri. Cât despre Partidul AUR, ei încă luptă lupta cea dreaptă, întrebându-se pentru noi toți ce caută iodul în sarea de la magazin. Alianța pentru Uniunea Românilor, AUR, a depus la Senat un proiect de lege privind interzicerea comercializării sării iodate, destinată consumului uman și pentru hrana animalelor, susținând că aceasta ar fi toxică. E toxică? Nu! Iodul din sare e bun pentru tiroidă, dar nu și pentru murături. Așa că puneți sare normală în murături și băgați cu încredere sare iodată în tot restul timpului. Informațiile astea vin, bineînțeles, de la unii care sunt chipurile experți. Dar Partidul AUR știe prea bine că adevărul nu vine de la experți. Adevărul e mai mult un sentiment. Spune-mi sincer, ce simți când te gândești la iodul din sare? Așa e că îți dă cu panică? Păi gata, ce alte dovezi să mai fie?
Tot AUR a făcut rost de numărul regelui nostru, Gică Hagi, și într-un act de maxim curaj politic i-au scris pe WhatsApp întrebându-l pe om dacă îi pot folosi imaginea. El fiind ocupat, nu a răspuns. AUR a tras imediat singura concluzie posibilă, că pot folosi imaginea după bunul plac. Așa că l-au pictat pe Hagi pe sediul partidului și presupun pregăteau și tricourile cu Hagi inimioară AUR. Între timp, Hagi a aflat. Sediul AUR din sectorul 6, pe care e pictat Hagi, este chiar lângă secția de poliție 21. În urmă cu câteva luni, tricolorul care era atârnat de la geam a fost înlocuit cu chipul voievodului Mihai Viteazu, pictat pe noul fundan galben al clădirii cu 2 etaje. Iar acum câteva zile, alături de chipul lui Mihai Viteazu, a fost pictată și imaginea lui Gică Hagi. Niciodată domnul Hagi nu va fi asociat cu vreun partid politic. Vom discuta cu avocatul nostru, cu departamentul juridic și vom lua măsurile necesare, a declarat Sorin Teodoreanu, ofițer de presă la Clubul Farul Constanța. Ca să parafrazăm un clasic, în viață, mototoul celor de la AUR pare să fie ai, n-ai acordul, pictezi ce vrei și te faci călai. Știe de fapt toată lumea că WhatsApp e un document legal și că dacă nu răspunzi acolo, practic ai zis da.
Cam atât pentru astăzi. Până săptămâna viitoare, fiți vigilenți. Dușmanul e pretutindeni.
Atât pentru astăzi, până miercurea viitoare, cu bine!